Hey everyone, this is a piece titled The Primacy of Politics in Post-Revolutionary Societies by Elmar Altvater. It was originally presented at the conference on, quote, post-revolutionary societies in Milan from January 4th to 7th, 1979. Translated by Christina Schufer, with editorial assistance by Don Fanatta. Sorry, I was looking to see if there's anything on Elmar Altvater. Wikipedia says Elmar Altvater lived from 1938 to 2018 as professor of political science at the Otto Zur Institute of the Free University of Berlin before retiring on the 30th of September 2004. Elmar Altvater continued to work at the institute and published articles and books. So there we go. The abstract for this particular piece says, the quote, actual socialist, end quote, societies are characterized by the quote, primacy of politics, end quote, rather than the quote, primacy of economics, end quote, of bourgeois societies. Actual socialist societies cannot be analyzed with the concept of quote, state capitalism, end quote, since even though the mode of production built on the quote, old division of labor, end quote, may be capitalist, the mode of domination, the way in which political authority is exercised, legitimated, and reproduced, is not. Therefore, the actual socialist social formation is not reducible to a capitalist social formation. Domination in actual socialism is embodied in the bureaucracy, whose principle of subordination and pursuit of its own particular interest at the expense of the whole of society's interests structure the social formation. The legitimation of this mode of domination is based upon its economic achievements, but the bureaucracy seeks to secure its own interests, which prevent economic success, even as the bureaucracy itself defines it. So actual socialist societies are caught in a constant cycle of decentralizing, market, and re-centralizing, plan, and reforms. The workers need only to realize that this form of society does not satisfy their real needs, which are for liberation from subordination to hierarchy and particular interest, in order for them to change actual socialism. So that's the abstract. I should mention that the reason I'm reading this is because it was source material in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. And also the title is striking to me, The Primacy of Politics in Post-Revolutionary Societies. I mean, I have no idea what this actual piece is going to say, but I feel like that's one of the one of the most important things, like theoretical description, is that this firm separation between economy and politics is something rather particular to capitalist society. And so when you have a society that, for instance, nationalizes the mode of production and the property of that society becomes state property, it's like the state and economic life become fundamentally fused in a very serious way. So you can't have like So there's this. You can't have this like firm division between like the economic basis of society and the sensible like superstructures or something like that. That's why I'm kind of interested in the title. Um, Again, I don't know what the hell this is going to say. Anyway, systematic comprehension and evaluation of the, quote, actual socialist, end quote, societies have certainly not improved in the last few years. Theoretical problems inherent in the various analytic approaches to post-revolutionary societies remain largely unsolved, and the resulting political and practical positions have remained unspecified. Let me see if there's a way. Let me see if I can duplicate this file and then so the notes. There's a footnote. Altvater's term is, quote, real existierenden sozialistischen Gesellschaften, end quote, or literally, quote, really existing socialist societies, end quote. This article follows David Fernbach's translation of Barrow, Rudolf Barrow. I have a piece by Herman Weber or Weber Herman. I can't remember which order it is, but he's like one of the most was a big scholar in West Germany about the history of East Germany, and I think he's probably dead now. But he wrote a piece about the place of Rudolf Barrow in the history of dissident socialist critiques of so-called really existing socialism. Anyway, let me continue this footnote. This article follows David Fernbach's translation of Barrow, bracket, 1978, end bracket, which uses, quote, actual, end quote, to render the phrase. Implied, among other things, is that this, quote, actual socialism, end quote, is not the only possible kind. So, end footnote. Countries like Vietnam and Kampuchea, which liberated themselves from imperialist domination only a few years ago and are now attempting to build socialist or communist societies, wage war on each other. The conflict between the largest actual socialist powers intensifies almost visibly. In the actual socialist countries, the internal difficulties of the old division of labor in factories and in society seem to be worsening to the point of causing severe social conflicts. The problems of environmental destruction in the actual socialist societies have attained life-threatening dimensions just as they have under capitalism. Such developments indicate that traditional categories cannot adequately grasp or comprehend the internal dynamic of post-revolutionary societies. I don't know if I said this, but this is from the Review of Radical Political Economics Spring 1981 issue. Bourgeois concepts trapped in the dichotomy of freedom and coercion are inappropriate. Some of these theories try to distinguish between authority mechanisms according to formal political criteria like Hannah Arendt's theory of, quote, totalitarianism. Other analyses attempt to categorize systems of production and distribution according to formal economic criteria. Von Mises's and Hayek's and Eugen's neoliberal economic theories, in which the open market and the central plan are equated with a liberal polity and a centralized administered polity, are examples of this unsuccessful tendency. Nor do, quote, totalitarianism, end quote, theories improve when they are used by left-wing communists, as Otto Rühle and to some extent Karl Korsch have done. The analogy between Hitler's fascism and Stalinism derived from these theories obstructs any understanding of the relations of social reproduction, consequently mystifying the relationships which maintain and recreate domination rather than analyzing them. Attempts at analysis which follow the Trotskyist tradition and Soviet developments in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union as mere, quote, deviations, end quote, are just as troublesome. Sorry, let me repeat that. Attempts at analysis which follow the Trotskyist tradition and interpret developments in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union as mere, quote, deviations, end quote, are just as troublesome. According to this argument, the revolution was betrayed. Original socialism has degenerated and the power of the working class has been bureaucratically perverted. Yet all the moments of the revolution continue to exist clandestinely. The task is to expose those moments of the revolution by eliminating the, quote, deviations, end quote. This interpretation is problematic because it sees Stalinism, bureaucratization, and oppression as a kind of, quote, sin, end quote, rather than as an expression of structural problems embedded in the revolutionary or post-revolutionary process itself. The analysis leaves mysterious how these deviations could develop in the first place and remakes history into a kind of conspiracy theory. Charles Bettelheim has presented an alternative framework at this conference, suggesting that the structural conditions and developmental dynamic of the so-called revolutionary societies can be comprehended with the concept of state capitalism. This idea comes out of an established tradition. The term state capitalism itself was used casually by Lenin and more precisely defined by Bukharin. The long history of left-wing communist critiques of the Soviet Union and later of the so-called, quote, socialist camp, end quote, is closely connected to this concept. In my opinion, however, an attempt to comprehend the actual socialist societies with the notion of state capitalism is doomed to fail because attempting to comprehend the actual socialist societies with the notion of state capitalism involves two insurmountable difficulties. First, most of the secrets of the mode of production of those countries which call themselves socialist will remain hidden as long as the form of domination is understood as capitalist exploitation, which is differentiated from capitalist exploitation in Western societies only because the appropriator, the administrator, and accumulator of surplus value, parenthesis, not surplus product, end parenthesis, is the state. Footnote. The German word, quote, Herrschaft, end quote, literally means, quote, lordship. Some English equivalents of the concept are, quote, domination, quote, authority, or, quote, sovereign authority, end quote. The term is translated throughout this article as, quote, domination. See Weber, 1978, for a discussion of the problems presented by its possible domination. Or Weber. It might be Weber. Let's see. Ah, bitch. No, it's not. Anyway, end footnote. Where the hell am I? External similarities to capitalist societies do exist because commodity production dominates, so do commodity-money relationships, and therefore, as Fidel Castro once noted, people continue to, quote, have their minds on the dollar, end quote. A labor market exists in which labor power offers labor power's self for a wage and is sold, but these externals cannot be traced to the same internal relations of social domination. Instead, the theory of state capitalism does not adequately comprehend capitalism, even as capitalism exists in Western countries, if that theory assumes that capitalist laws of motion and capitalist forms of domination and consciousness are perpetuated in the actual socialist countries. This assumption is incorrect because capitalism is not only a social formation with particular laws of motion. Capitalism is also a specific mystified form of domination, which in the process of the reproduction of capital also reproduces itself due to its own laws of motion. Constructing a single conceptual framework, which is applied to different societies in a slightly modified form, in order to categorize them all in the same way, is a mechanical mode of inquiry. Moreover, even if it continues to employ Marxist terminology, this form of analysis completely negates the Marxist method, which involves isolating categories from the internal relationship of social reproduction in order to specifically describe and analyze the form and content of a society's structure and development. New section. The transition from the primacy of economics to the primacy of politics. In order to give our political praxis a rationally founded object, our analytic concepts must be made more precise. Eastern European societies should be interpreted neither as capitalist nor as socialist nor as transitional societies, but societies with their own mode of production. That would be similar to a bureaucratic collectivist thesis. Some people say a new mode of production without a consolidated ruling class. That's like another way. of saying it, like, which is distinct from the bureaucratic collectivist thesis, but we'll see what Altvater has to say. This is what Rudolf Barrow has done. Rudolf Barrow refers to East European societies as, quote, proto-socialist societies, end quote, as, quote, socialism in the cocoon stage, end quote, as, quote, despotic forms of domination resting on a non-capitalist but also non-socialist base of reproduction, end quote. How does this separate independent mode of production develop? It is, of course, initiated by a revolutionary act. Parenthesis, if we did not assume such an act, this conference's title, quote, post-revolutionary societies, would be nonsense. We can define this act of revolution both positively and negatively. It is a negative act in the sense that the power base of the pre-revolutionary ruling class is eliminated, that is, the class's ownership of the means of production is abolished in the act of socialization. It is positive in that the socialization of the means of production is a first step towards the elimination of economically determined domination, creating the possibility for determining the social dynamic of development politically. The act of socialization initiates the transition from the bourgeois primacy of economics to the primacy of politics. This argument, which has recently been advanced by Jan Jaroslavsky, requires elaboration. Let's see if I can find anything for Jan Jaroslavsky. Jan Jaroslavsky. According to German Wikipedia, Jan Jaroslavsky was a professor at the University of Bremen in the Department of the Theory of Political Systems from 1972 to 1990. Jan Jaroslavsky is best known for his comprehensive study of the sociology of the Communist Party. Jaroslavsky was deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to Auschwitz concentration camp in 1943 and experienced the end of World War II during one of the death marches that took place as part of the dissolution of the German concentration camps when the U.S. Army invaded Upper Palatinate. After the war, Jaroslavsky returned to his hometown of Lodz, or I don't know how you say that. I think it's pronounced differently than how it's spelled, where Jan Jaroslavsky studied sociology. At the end of the 1940s, Jan Jaroslavsky married Helena Jaroslavsky, who lived from 1922 to 2016, whom Jan Jaroslavsky had known since studying in Warsaw. The couple had 2 sons. In the first post-war years, after completing his studies, Jan Jaroslavsky worked as a sociologist at the National Institute of Urban Affairs, now the National Institute of Architecture and Urban Affairs, Later, Jan Jaroslavsky worked on the editorial team of the political magazine Nowe Drogi, New Ways, until the whole family emigrated from Poland for political reasons in the autumn of 1968 and settled in Fischerhude near Bremen in the Federal Republic of Germany. In 1972, during the founding period, Jan Jaroslavsky was called to the University of Bremen. Jan Jaroslavsky's wife, Helena Jaroslavsky, also taught at the University of Bremen as a professor of political economy from 1972 to 1987. Jan Jaroslavsky's political and scientific views were strongly influenced by the ongoing discourse with the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, with whom he had a lifelong friendship. Leszek Kolakowski, if you don't know, wrote like a very huge volume on the main theories of the main strands of Marxism or whatever. After Jan Jaroslavsky's retirement in 1990, Jan Jaroslavsky devoted 5 years to a, quote, political diary, end quote. A chronicler of his time, Jan Jaroslavsky noted the outstanding events of this period of upheaval and national and international conflict between 1991 and 1995, which he also commented on from a unique perspective based on his experience of the war. So, his books include Theory of the Socialist Revolution, forward by Leszek Kolakowski, Sociology of the Communist Party, published in 1978, The Intellectuals and Socialism, published in 1981, The Marxist Movement and the Polish Question, 1989, and Essays by Jan Jaroslavsky. Back to the text. This argument, which has recently been advanced by Jan Jaroslavsky, requires elaboration. This notion of the transition from the primacy of economics to the primacy of politics does not imply that in bourgeois society the political is exclusively determined by the economic, so that politics must follow economics as in a base superstructure schema. Rather, the primacy of economics means that the reproduction of the political realm is still mediated economically. The state apparatus must depend on fiscal revenue in order to be politically effective. The state's means of social intervention are tied to the structure and the contradictions of bourgeois society. The state's power, money, and law, parenthesis, we will not consider pure force, the state's coercive power here, end parenthesis, does not grow out of its political system, but is, quote, taken from, end quote, the social structure. The very domination of one class over another remains tied to the economic basis of reproduction of the system. True, quote, hegemony, end quote, is maintained through the institutions of the political system, quote, state, and, quote, civil society. But the economic system is still the basis of the creation, maintenance, and reproduction of hegemony. This becomes particularly apparent in times of crisis. When it is faced with a political crisis of hegemony, the bourgeoisie withdraws to the sphere of economic compulsion, thereby allowing, for example, the effects of the economic crisis to have a disciplining function. It could be demonstrated in particular instances that the relations of domination in bourgeois/capitalist societies are mediated economically. Therefore, we can speak of the primacy of economics without deteriorating into economist shortcuts or materialist contractions. Jaroslavsky points out that even in bourgeois society, the political party of the, quote, subordinate, end quote, strata, that is, parenthesis, if it is developed enough, end parenthesis, the working class, opposes the primacy of politics to this primacy of economics. Opposes the primacy of politics to this primacy of economics, which is a condition of bourgeois domination. If the working class wants to overcome the domination of the bourgeoisie, then the working class cannot accomplish the overcoming of the domination of the bourgeoisie by restricting the working class's entry to the economic sphere. The, quote, economic constraints, end quote, with which the bourgeoisie operates theoretically, as well as politically, can be broken politically. In this context, the debates about economism that are carried out within the working class movement are meaningful. Therefore, it is absolutely crucial that those unions which operate primarily in the realm of economics be, quote, politicized, end quote. They must withdraw from these economic actualities and oppose to these economic actualities political goals and political alternatives, both in their demands and in their forms of action which they choose. The theory of the primacy of politics no longer contains a considerable dose of idealism or voluntarism, but this could not be otherwise. The theory of the primacy of politics no doubt contains a considerable dose of idealism or voluntarism, but this could not be otherwise as long as this will seeks to find the political organizational forms of action which would change the social system. If this revolutionary transformation of the social system is successful, The primacy of politics is thereby given a new dimension. When the state apparatus is controlled by the Revolutionary Party, the party develops the means which allow it to exercise the primacy of politics. Economic relations and profit maximization no longer impose those constraints which characterize the limits of the bourgeois state's interventionism. In capitalism, the laws of motion are determined by the realization and accumulation of capital. All aspects of social life are subordinated to these economically founded and determined relations of domination. This is the primacy of economics. With the socialization of the means of production, however, the political organs (state and party) are given means to concretize and to make relevant the primacy of politics. If we disregard for a moment the limitation of resources (we will return to this) we can see that social developments are made, quote, more possible, end quote, in post-revolutionary societies than they were under capitalism, because the economic constraints which result from the contradictions inherent in the realization of capital no longer exist. Therefore, it is thoroughly misleading to portray both concretely existing socialism and capitalism as two forms of expression of the developmental dynamic of capitalism, or as both subject to the same laws of quantification as capitalism, as Renate Damas does. Renata Damas, who lived from 1940 to 1992, was a German political scientist and politician of the Green Party. Renata Damas was initially politically socialized in the Freiburg RCDS, with whose then chairman, Wolfgang Schäuble, she worked together. In 1971, Renata Damas received her doctorate from the Free University of Berlin with the dissertation Ernst Bloch, Hope as Principle, Principle Without Hope. From 1974, Renata Damas taught as a professor with a focus on planned economic systems at the University of Osnabrück. In connection with the founding of this university and the planned appointment of the Marxist economist Ernest Mandel, Renata Damas was described in the press as a leading, quote, communist professor, end quote. From 1990 to 1991, Renata Damas was the federal executive spokesperson for the Greens. Before that, Renata Damas had already been secretary of the Federal Executive Board of the party. Renata Damas belonged to the inter-party movement Left Forum. Damas died at the age of only 52 due to a serious illness. It says her books include Ernst Bloch, Hope as Principle, Principle Without Hope, from 1971, Decision-Making Structures and Functional Problems in the GDR Economy, 1973, Real System as a System of Rule Using the Example of the GDR, Critique of Post-Capitalist Society, published in 1978, CMEA, Economic Cooperation in Eastern Europe, from 1979, and The Legend of System Competition, Capitalist and Real Socialist Industrial Society, published in 1986. Back to the text. Therefore, it is thoroughly misleading to portray both concretely existing socialism and capitalism as two forms of expression of the developmental dynamics of capitalism, or as both subject to the same laws of quantification as capitalism, as Renata Damas does, Capitalism is not concerned with abstract growth rates. abstractly increased consumption, and so on, but with capital accumulation and profit maximization. Actual socialism is different. Even if words like profit and earnings are used, their social content is fundamentally different from that which prevails in capitalist relations of production. Because of this difference, domination is founded, mediated, and legitimated differently in these countries than in bourgeois societies. The quote, unified mechanism, end quote, of domination. We will describe the institutional forms of the primacy of politics in order to discover the specific bases from which the social system of domination in the actual socialist societies reproduces itself. It follows from the primacy of politics that the basis of the legitimation of domination is much more politicized than it is in capitalist countries. Therefore, problems of political consciousness, of ideology, and so on are extraordinarily important. Of course, one cannot say that ideology plays no legitimating role in bourgeois societies. But as Yaroslavsky points out, no one would maintain that the Labour or Conservative parties are equally as important for the foundation of domination in Great Britain as the Socialist Unity Party of the German Democratic Republic or the Communist Party of the Soviet Union are for the maintenance of domination in actual socialism. Another piece of evidence also supports our thesis. Those strata and groups which are responsible for consciousness and ideology play a much more important role in the actual socialist countries. They are part of the process of stabilization and destabilization of political domination than they do in bourgeois capitalist societies. In this context, one might remember the significance accorded to gatherings of intellectuals, like the 1963 Kafka Conference in Prague, or the role of intellectuals in the crystallization of oppositional consciousness in the GDR, or the importance of intellectuals' protest in Poland in 1970 and 1976, when the uprisings along the coast at the Ursus plant and in other cities caused the party elite to totter. It looks like Ursus SA is a Polish agricultural machinery manufacturer headquartered in Lublin, Poland. The company was founded in Warsaw in 1939 and has strong historic roots regarding Polish tractor production history. It has also carried out some production of trolley buses in a joint venture with Ukrainian manufacturer Bogdan, and manufactures buses, coaches, and trolley buses in a joint venture with AMZ Kutno under the name Ursus Bus. The name means, quote, bear, as in like grizzly bear, in Latin. So I'm assuming that this is if it still exists, it was part of it existed through the Soviet period. Back to the text. In this context, one might remember the significance accorded to gatherings of intellectuals like the 1963 Kafka Conference in Prague, or the role of intellectuals in the crystallization of oppositional consciousness in the GDR, or the importance of intellectuals' protests in Poland in 1970 and 1976, when the uprisings along the coast at the Ursus plant and in other cities caused the party elite to totter. Especially noteworthy here are the attempts of the party to prevent an alliance between intellectuals and workers. This strategy plays an important role in the GDR as well as in Poland, and it became evident in Czechoslovakia with the reaction to, quote, Charter 77. And according to Wikipedia, Charter 77 was an informal civic initiative in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic from 1976 to 1992, named after the document Charter 77 from January 1977. Founding members and architects were Jiří Němec, Vaclav Benda, Ladislav Hajdanek, Vaclav Havel, Jan Patoska, Zdenek Milnyar, Jiri Hayek, Martin Palus, Pavel Kohut, and Ladislav Lis. Spreading the text of the document was considered a political crime by the Czechoslovak government. After the 1989 Velvet Revolution, many of the members of the initiative played important roles in Czech and Slovak politics. Or Slovak politics. Back to the text. In actual socialism, as opposed to capitalism, the state cannot entrench itself behind the autonomy of private property. Instead, the state stands directly in the center of total social responsibility. The bourgeois separation of state and society, which remains despite partial interpenetration, no longer exists in the actual socialist societies. A, quote, unified mechanism, end quote, whose operation is politically regulated, exists in these countries, a mechanism which derives its legitimation from its actual functioning. The fact that planned goals and planned figures and their fulfillment have legitimating effects is a consequence of this non-separation of state and society, of the, quote, unified mechanism, end quote. We must note here the problem inherent in quantitative growth projections and goals. This problematic of quantity becomes ever more apparent when nature appears as the outer limit and boundary of production. The actual socialist societies have not created an organic relationship between human beings, society, and nature, and these relations remain much as they exist in capitalist societies. The outer limits are reproduced as, quote, these outer limits are reproduced as scarcity. The outer limits almost seem to be the precondition for the maintenance of domination in the actual socialist societies. I will elaborate on this below. New section. The continued existence of the, quote, old division of labor, end quote, as the basis of domination. We have shown it follows from the primacy of politics that the foundation of domination is political. But why, and this is the next question which we pose for ourselves, does the domination of some people over others continue to exist at all after the revolution without having been overcome partially during the decades of the existence of post-revolutionary regimes? After all, Marx and Engels assumed that after the revolution, the emancipation of people would follow once relations of domination had been made superfluous with the gradual, quote, receding, end quote, bracket, Rücknahme, end bracket, of the state into society. In the actual socialist societies, we do not see the recession of the state into society in the sense of an elimination of the state, bracket, Entstaatlichung, end bracket. Instead, we are faced with the creation of a, quote, unified mechanism, end quote, of state and society, with a thorough nationalization not only of the means of production but of all social realms and processes. Barrow locates the basis of the political, economic, social system in post-revolutionary societies in the continued existence of the, quote, old division of labor, end quote, which was not abolished together with the private ownership of the means of production. Significant here are the division of labor between urban and rural areas, the resulting domination of the city over the countryside, the division of labor between men and women, and the resulting domination of men over women, and finally, and especially important, the division of labor between intellectual and manual work, and the resulting domination of intellectual over manual labor. These divisions of labor, which do not result from the private ownership of the means of production, but have a history that extends far beyond that social fact, cannot simply be abolished with an act of socialization. While these divisions and the nature of character of their domination are formed differently in actual socialist societies, these divisions and the nature of the and character of their domination, While these divisions and the nature of the character of their domination are formed differently in the actual socialist societies than these divisions are in capitalism, these divisions are no less effective and no less intertwined with domination. Compared to their capitalist past, the institutional definitions of these divisions of labor are transformed in actual socialism. Nevertheless, they are more than just, quote, birthmarks of the old society, end quote, as Marx put it, since their continued existence signifies the emergence of completely autonomous relations of the production of domination. These relations no longer derive their basis from the economic structure of society as they do while the means of production are privately owned. Instead, as we have shown, they are primarily politically mediated. New section: Political despotism as a form of domination. Now that we have located the origin of politically mediated domination in the old division of labor, without having been forced to resort to construction/concepts like the, quote, new bourgeoisie or, quote, state bourgeoisie, end quote, we can inquire as our next step how this political domination is exercised. Rudolf Barrow compares actual socialism to Asiatic modes of production because of the significant role played by politically mediated as opposed to economically mediated domination. In the Asiatic mode of production, political despotism was based on economic stagnation. Everything possible is done to prevent capital accumulation in order to obstruct the creation of autonomous capitalist centers. The development of trade was permitted only as far as the development of trade was necessary to ensure the transfer of surplus product from the rural areas to the cities. Surplus product was not accumulated. The portion of surplus product which was not channeled into general social projects necessary to maintain the basis of the society's reproduction, such as irrigation and armies, was stocked in the treasury as wealth. As a result, those societies that were organized on the basis of the Asiatic mode of production either stagnated or developed extremely slow over centuries. See Lawrence Crowder. End parenthesis. This concept of the Asiatic mode of production, whose functioning I have only outlined here, is employed by Barrow to characterize the form of domination which exists in the actual socialist countries as political despotism. This concept of the Asiatic mode of production, whose functioning I have only outlined here, is employed by Barrow to characterize the form of domination which exists in the actual socialist countries as political despotism. Such a characterization may be appropriate for Russia's Asiatic past, and it may even illuminate some moments of the specific form of domination in the Soviet Union, but it is not a useful starting point for an analysis of domination in the highly industrialized Eastern European societies. We find that the ruler's rationale in the actual socialist societies is not stagnation but increasing growth. We see only one similarity between the Asiatic mode of production and actual socialism, the political form of despotic domination which is recognizable in the proto-socialist societies. Even though these societies no longer have an economically mediated form of class domination, domination itself has by no means been abolished, finding its political expression in despotism. We want to clarify here that we do not use the concept of political despotism to characterize an archaic system of domination. We use the concept of political despotism to refer to a highly modern system of domination. Political power is exercised in the economic realm through the despotic means derived from the primacy of politics. The result of employing these means is not stagnation but continuous transformation. Therefore, despotic domination must eventually reproduce its basis. In other words, even despotic domination in actual socialist societies cannot exist without legitimation. In other words, even despotic domination in the actual socialist societies cannot exist without legitimation. The legitimation derives from economic success, that is, the inherent dynamic of development in the social system. We will see that the periodic contradictions which destabilize political domination in the post-revolutionary societies result precisely from this dynamic. Next section: The bureaucracy as institutional form of despotism. The next step of our analysis, we will investigate the institutional forms which despotic domination takes. Contrary to the Asiatic mode of production, despotism in the actual socialist countries does not imply the establishment of centers of domination, nor the existence of units of social production, consumption, and reproduction which carry on a mode of work and life largely independently and detached from these centers. Lawrence Cratter refers to the contradiction between, quote, communal form and, quote, social substance, end quote, in the Asiatic mode of production, end parenthesis. It implies instead a system consisting of mechanisms of domination which penetrate all realms of social life and of work. This system is best described as bureaucracy. According to Max Weber, bureaucratic structures have several characteristics. An institution is divided into fixed and official jurisdictions, which are governed by rules. The different areas are ordered according to hierarchical principles. The management of offices is based upon written documents, and administrative officials are separated from the means of administration. Although we refer to Max Weber's definition, this does not mean that we want to draw an analogy between bureaucracy and capitalism on the one hand and actual socialism on the other. There is a crucial difference. With the socialization of the means of production, the bureaucracy is given the means with which to direct production, while in capitalism the bureaucracy always remains subordinated to private conditions of capitalist accumulation and value realization. The characteristics of bureaucratic domination in the actual socialist countries, namely non-ownership of the means of production, non-inheritability of power and property, independence from a ruling class, have been discussed by Trotsky, Deutscher, Marcuse, and Hoffman. Who's Hoffman? Maybe it's David L. Hoffman? I don't know. Maybe not. No, it's not Hoffman. David L. Hoffman. Maybe it's Eric Hoffman? Sorry, I'm going to look this person up. I've never seen this name before in my life. Sorry. Sorry, I can't find anything for this Hoffman person. These traits are nothing more than social and legal expressions of the social fact that social decision-making organs are no longer tied to the autonomous process of capital realization. Instead, the bureaucracies are able to organize desired social developments as these follow from the primacy of politics. The new dimension of bureaucracy is expressed primarily in the possibilities of central planning. In the actual socialist countries, Lenin's, quote, commanding heights of the economy, end quote, are at the disposal of the bureaucracy. This new dimension of bureaucracy is expressed primarily in the possibility of central planning. In the actual socialist countries, Lenin's, quote, commanding heights of the economy, end quote, are at the disposal of the bureaucracy. I just want to tell, I don't know if I said this already in this recording because I'm kind of recording this in blocks, but when I repeat a sentence, it means that there's italics in it. But this social fact embodies a contradiction. As opposed to the original goals and possibilities of the revolution, the development of a bureaucracy is a regression, a step backward from the intended socialization of actual public ownership. The intended socialization to the actual public ownership of the means of production. With its development, a contradiction between those who possess monopoly power and the masses constitutes itself. The power of the bureaucracy, as Isaac Deutscher writes, quote, is exceptional because the power of the bureaucracy is economic, political, and cultural at the same time. Yet paradoxically, each of these elements of power has had its origins in an act of liberation, ... The conflict between the origins of the power and its character, between the liberating uses for which it was intended and the uses to which it has been put, has perpetually generated high political tensions and recurrent purges, ... End quote. The bureaucracy has, quote, not been able to convince the masses or even themselves that they have used their power in a manner compatible with ... the acts of liberation from which they derive their power ... In other words, the, quote, new class, end quote, has not obtained for itself the sanctions of social legitimacy, end quote. Isaac Deutscher, 1969. Here lies the origin of the insecurity of the basis of bureaucratic power in actual socialism. That insecurity in turn compels a permanent justification for the development of bureaucratic power. Forced industrial development constitutes the justification. Forced industrial development is the basis of the bureaucracy's legitimacy. Therefore, bureaucracy is forced to emphasize that bureaucracy's social efficiency more in socialism than in capitalism. That bureaucracy must give evidence of success, such as high rates of economic growth, rapid industrialization, educational opportunities for all strata of the population, and achievements in science and technology. The bureaucracy equates economic efficiency with the construction of socialism, thereby integrating the original revolutionary goals into a bureaucratically abridged calculus of efficiency in an effort to escape the threat which its revolutionary origins posed to its existence. This is how the non-antagonistic connection between bureaucracy and subordination is continually reproduced. Realms of activity are divided up into areas of competence, and social unity is fragmented into particular spheres which then regulate the responsibilities of the individual or the single group. According to Barra, both the responsibility of the cleaning woman for clean hallways and that of the Central Committee for War and Peace are regulated in this way. This fragmentation of social unity into particularized spheres produces social and political narrow-mindedness. Even the reunification of particular interests in the sense of a social synthesis remains necessarily narrow-minded. Such a synthesis is essentially the expression of the particular interests of the bureaucracy, even if those interests are camouflaged with the corresponding ideological formulas such as, quote, socialist construction, end quote, the battle for production, end quote, or, quote, over-fulfillment of the plan, end quote. It is noteworthy that the rationality of the bureaucracy does not entail the bureaucracy's homogeneity. The bureaucrat's rationality is concerned only with the technique of administration and with the regularity of the institution's activities. The bureaucracy is not concerned with the content and goals of its actions on the social organism. Particularism dominates the bureaucratic structure, and particularism dominating the bureaucratic structure is especially true for the state bureaucracy. As Yaroslavsky's analysis shows, the state cannot reflect the totality of social needs because, with the socialization of the means of production, the state has assimilated into itself the contradictions that exist between individual units of production and consumption. Left to itself, the economy would not be able to take a significant step forward. In actual socialism, the economy cannot express itself spontaneously. Spontaneity is not only unwanted, it is actually impossible, because all economic activities, the society's entire productive existence, are entirely dependent on directives constantly issued by the state. It follows that the state institutions are the only real motors of economic development. Bracket, Yaroslavsky, 1978, end bracket. The state of the sole economic subject, as Vosnesensky's, quote, locomotive of the motion and development of the economy, end quote, thereby takes over all the particular interests that are contained in the economy. One second, I'm going to look at this person. Vosnesensky. One second. Okay, that's who I was looking for. Nikolai Vosnesensky lived from 1903 to 1950 and was a Soviet politician and economic planner who oversaw the running of Gosplan, parenthesis, the USSR State Planning Committee, end parenthesis, during the German-Soviet War of 1941 to 45. A protege of Andrei Zhdanov, Vosnesensky was appointed deputy premier in May 1940. Vosnesensky became directly involved in the recovery of production associated with the evacuation of industry eastwards after the start of the war. Vosnesensky's 1947 work, The Economy of the USSR During World War II, quote, the war economy in the USSR in the time of the Patriotic War, end quote, records those years. Following the war, Nikolai Vosnesensky was persecuted during the 1949 to 1950 Leningrad affair. In a secret trial, Nikolai Vosnesensky was found guilty of treason, sentenced to death, and executed immediately. The military collegium of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union rehabilitated Vosnesensky in 1954. Vosnesensky was a close associate of Alexei Kosygin and Mikhail Rodionov. Back to the text. The state as the sole economic subject is Vosnesensky's, quote, locomotive of the motion and development of the economy, end quote, thereby takes over all the particular interests that are contained in the economy. A fatal situation results. The state bureaucracy cannot simply derive a uniformity of action out of its own rationality. Rather, the bureaucracy stands in need of, quote, direction, end quote, from the party. Thus, the party becomes the embodiment of the primacy of politics. We can see, then, that the duplicate party and state bureaucracy, which Barrow analyzes with the example of the German Democratic Republic, corresponds to the logic of the system of domination. We can add the observation that while capitalist bureaucracies derive their rationality from the principle of profitability, from the realization of capital which subsumes all activity, the necessity of political direction which can be carried out by the party follows from the primacy of politics. The party's central position for the stability and instability of the system of domination in actual socialism had its foundation and explanation in the structuring of the society according to the primacy of politics. Following Yaroslavsky, it probably would be no exaggeration to advance the hypothesis that the crisis in the socialist countries has its origins in the party, capital P, party as an institution. Following Yaroslavsky, it probably would be no exaggeration to advance the hypothesis that the crisis in the socialist country has had its origin in the party as an institution. That's from, that didn't have italics, that just seemed like an important sentence to me. New section. Scarcity as the basis of the reproduction of bureaucracy. How does bureaucratic domination reproduce bureaucratic domination itself in actual socialism? This is our next question. We can suggest that the foundation of bureaucratic domination is scarcity, and the administration of scarcity. Trotsky remarked that bureaucracies can only develop when peoples have to stand in line for particular consumer goods. But what does it mean to refer to bureaucracy as the administration of scarcity? Given the immense wealth which capitalism has now generated, it might seem that one could hardly speak of scarcity in capitalism any longer. We can ignore for the moment the fact that absolute scarcity continues to exist in the world and in subordinate strata of the highly developed capitalist countries because of the distribution of wealth. Scarcity, however, also remains the structuring principle according to which the profitability of capital determines itself. The goal of maximum capital realization is continually interrupted due to the scarcity of necessary means. Although there may be the greatest possible exploitation of the worker, it is never great enough for capital. Even if the production of a particular good has already covered a large portion of the market, it is still not sufficient to eliminate competition entirely. The demand for a product may be enormous, but is never sufficient to guarantee the realization of the hoped-for and calculated profit. Therefore, in capitalism, scarcity is a structural principle of development which is insurmountable. As a result, under the profitability principle of the bourgeois/capitalist mode of production, the bureaucratic administration of scarcity is a, quote, social law of nature, end quote. Scarcity remains a structuring principle even in actual socialism. This principle is necessarily implied in the previously mentioned quantification inherent in that mode of production. Such quantitative narrow-mindedness derives directly from the principles of legitimation of despotic domination. These principles include, as we have noted above, attaining the highest possible growth rates for the social product, increasing consumption, industrializing, and increasing expenditures for education, etc. Moreover, this narrow-mindedness is necessarily reproduced continually, and its reproduction is reinforced by the bureaucracy. As we have seen, the bureaucracy always represents particular interests which find a pseudo-reconciliation in the systematic goal of increased growth, a goal that is then identified with socialism. Rudolf Barrow is correct in pointing out that a very rigid plan without reserves follows from this, quote, growth goal, end quote, orientation. But such a plan without reserves makes a democratically structured production process impossible, since it cancels any scope for alternatives from the very beginning. Quote, without a reservoir of labor power in relation to the plan, democracy within the factory is well nigh impossible for production workers, end quote. Barrow. The plan thus opens up no real alternative structures. Likewise, little time beyond their planned work hours remains for workers to participate in democratic decision-making structures and in the calculation of alternative plans. But this means that the producing and consuming subject ultimately remains subject to the world of objects, because after all the plan is justified with reference to economic needs and necessities. In this way, the realm of necessity is extended and is juxtaposed to the realm of freedom. That is, necessity is opposed to the sphere of the subjective and qualitative as a pure and an insurmountable barrier again and again. This is different from capitalism, where we have seen the structure of scarcity be fundamental to the principle of capital realization. Actual socialism reproduces scarcity as a barrier to human and natural resources. The perpetuation of the bourgeois concept of science, the persistently optimistic evaluation of productive powers, and the scientific/technical revolution, the nonchalance towards natural resources, and ultimately towards the inner and outer nature of man, all imply a mechanism of regulation which continually avoids coming to terms with the one power. Bracket. Grossa, Grosse, I guess that could be Grossa or Yeah, Groessa. I don't know. Groassa. I don't know. Nature, which at the scarcity as the scarcity producing quote disturbance factor end quote, always corrects the plans in the end. As long as no alternative conception of nature and science is developed and opposed to the crude productive power optimism of historical materialism and dialectical materialism, the primacy of politics, which undoubtedly indicates progress over the primacy of economics, will degenerate into the same deficient narrow-mindedness that determines the everyday calculation of profitability in capitalism. New section. The contradiction between efficiency and the legitimation of bureaucracy. The social (or even the economic) plan gives us the only guarantee that political consciousness can come to power over the destructive spontaneity of economics. Some participants in the discussion that occurred in the Soviet Union during the 1920s, such as Preobrazhensky, already emphasized the significance of the law of the plan as opposed to the spontaneity of the law of value. The plan, as the expression and embodiment of the primacy of politics, was to be a guarantee that the limits of social reproduction were not to be treated as fixed outer limits, but as malleable and ever extensible boundaries that could be included in and subjected to social decision-making. The plan was to be an expression of the primacy of politics formulated by the party as an institution. We don't dwell here on its technical problems. It is exactly this relationship between plan and party which constitutes itself as a contradiction and periodically breaks out as a crisis. In order to explain this further, we will begin with a proposition. In the actual socialist countries, a contradiction exists between the economy's efficiency and the bureaucracy's basis of legitimation. The bureaucracy, that is, the state and party bureaucracies, must always be pulled between the goal of growth and the organizational forms that are necessary to reach that growth. Because of the particularism of bureaucratic measures, even if those actions are claimed to represent the interests of society as a whole, difficulties always arise. As a result of the existing measure of efficiency, based as we have seen on narrow-minded quantification, those difficulties are registered as defects and inefficiencies. In a plan-guided economy which does not actually function according to the politically formulated will of society as a whole, the institutional basis of the economy, that is, the state and party bureaucracy, will then enter a crisis because its own legitimation is based on and therefore dependent on economic efficiency. Economic reforms are the result. Because of the primacy of politics, such reforms can be made relatively easily, much more easily than in capitalist economies, especially in the guidance mechanisms of the economy. The many economic reforms in the actual socialist countries, which fluctuate between centralization and decentralization, must be understood not only in their economic implications, however, but also as bureaucratic reforms. With these reforms, the bureaucracy seeks to give itself a new institutional, organizational form so that the bureaucracy can improve the efficiency of the economy and of social development, in order thereby to preserve its basis of legitimation. Such reforms do not fundamentally transform the structure of domination in the actual socialist societies, nor they help to transform the relationship among humans, nature, and society. Such fundamental transformations, however, would be the only possible way to generate a qualitative, use-value-oriented alternative social goal that could be opposed to the quantification which dominates planning now. Let us look at the economic reforms that were carried out in all the Eastern European countries, including the Soviet Union, in the 1960s, only to be more or less revoked later on. the failure of the central planning model is not just the result of difficulties in conceiving, realizing, and controlling the plan. Rather, central planning came into contradiction with bureaucratic domination's principle of subordination and the particularism which results from it. Rather, central planning came into contradiction with bureaucratic domination's principle of subordination and the particularism which resulted from it. The social claims of the plan were broken on the bureaucracy's particular interests. Here it is useful to remember the forms taken by the regulation of particular interest in bourgeois/capitalist societies. In the realm of economics, through the competition that occurs between particular interests in the market, capitalist societies have a mechanism constituting a social principle that creates something like a social synthesis. This takes place behind the backs of the producers and at enormous cost to society. The laws of motion of the mode of production, which Marx analyzed, are nothing but the socially average results of particular units of capital and single workers or collectives of workers. The market apparently provides a mechanism which transforms the particular individual egoisms into a social optimum, or at least into the second best, Such is this much in the sense of Mandeville, who in his Fable of the Bees spoke of, quote, the private vices which transform themselves into public virtues, end quote. In a manner analogous to the market mechanism in the economic realm, the pluralism of the political system filters and regulates particular political interests, at least those that are not marginalized, that is, repressed by state intervention, end parenthesis. According to the model, bourgeois society can cope with the problems that result from subordination and particularism. We know that in the course of bourgeois social development, especially as a result of monopolization and the crisis tendencies in the economic sphere, and in the development of the socially active subject, the working class, this market regulation and pluralist filtering came to play a decreasing role as opposed to the increase in state intervention and manipulation. The result is that particular social interests reproduce themselves as political administrative contradictions in the realm of the state, in the broad sense, New section. The impossibility of market regulation of contradictions. In actual socialism, the boundaries for these, quote, regulating mechanisms, end quote, are narrowly drawn. When speaking of the market and of pluralism, we are not referring to, quote, mechanisms, end quote, in a technical sense, which could be subjugated to different social circumstances or social systems. Rather, they are social principles which influence the social structure. This distinction is clearly demonstrated by the historical development of the post-revolutionary societies. An example is the transition to market regulation under the new economic policy in the Soviet Union after 1921. A new class of small and middle peasants, merchants, and artisans developed. This class had the potential to create great economic and political difficulties for the Bolshevik Party, which sought acceptance for the primacy of politics in planning and industrialization. The primacy of politics demands economic and social planning, and the primacy of politics erodes in situations in which the market mechanism is given great leeway. Given such leeway, the primacy of economics again flourishes. This is the case even if the means of production remain state property, since in order for the market mechanism to flourish, the enterprise leadership's autonomy must be increased so that management can react flexibly to market data. So, if the pursuit of particular interests has not already led to an expansion of regulation by the market, in an effort to help reduce conflicts resulting from the contradictions between subordination and the general social claim of the bureaucracy, then the market mechanism will produce particularist subordinate behavior out of itself. The significance of the market mechanism lies in the fact that it makes subordinate behavior functional and thereby reduces its potential for conflict. It does so, however, at the cost of weakening the primacy of politics while strengthening the primacy of economics. The social basis of the party is thereby undermined. This is why a centralizing mood always follows those economic reforms, which give greater influence to the market mechanism. Here then is the rational explanation for policies that fluctuate between centrally planned and decentralized economic direction. We must make an important qualification, however. We are speaking of the market, which exists between enterprise units of a nationalized socialist economy, not the market for consumer products and labor power. We're speaking of the market which exists between enterprise units of a nationalized socialist economy, not the market for consumer products and labor power. As long as money mediates the exchange of commodities, market relations cannot be abolished, unless this occurs at the price of central direction of labor power and rationing measures. In the markets, furthermore, participants are not only units of production, but also units of consumption. Households. Vladimir Bruce. Excuse me, I pronounced that wrong probably. Vladimir Bruce lived from 1921 to 2007, was an economist and party functionary in communist Poland. He emigrated from Poland in 1972, removed from power after the 1968 Polish political crisis. Bruce spent the rest of his life in the United Kingdom. Vladimir Bruce has emphasized that these markets' existence in a situation of scarcity is a precondition for preventing the unnecessary curtailing of political freedom. The abolition of the market in the consumer sector through rationing not only reduces freedom of consumption and eliminates (and actually never existed) quote, consumer sovereignty, end quote, it also implies the creation of another economic political control apparatus, that is, the inclusion of still more social realms in the bureaucratic structure of domination. We can make a similar statement about the restriction or the elimination of the labor market by means of a system of centrally administered work, which would also mean the curtailing or even the elimination of basic liberties. Therefore, the development of a market can have quite different consequences for bureaucratic domination, depending on which market we consider. While the development of a market in consumer products and in labor power is a basic condition for a market of political liberty, I said that completely wrong. While the development of a market in consumer products and in labor power is a basic condition for a degree of political liberty, the development of a market among enterprises implies increasing privileges for a social stratum that can regressively undermine the very basis of the system of domination. The problems that markets create can be examined in any market-oriented actual socialist society such as Yugoslavia or Hungary. This discussion should make clear that in the actual socialist countries, the political forms of domination in practice, whether pursuing the primacy of politics by means of centralized planning or attempting to solve the problems resulting from the contradiction between centralism and particularism by means of market regulation, are unable to transform the constructed foundation of bureaucratic despotic domination. At best, through specific bureaucratic reforms, they can restore temporary, quote, breathing space, end quote, within the system of domination. New section: subordination, immobilism, and emancipated interests. Bureaucratic domination's inefficiency generates another set of problems, since the bureaucratic form maintains the subordination of the working masses, resulting in an economic and social immobilism. The preservation and improvement of economic efficiency is totally governed by the bureaucracy's needs for legitimation. The preservation and improvement of economic efficiency is totally governed by the bureaucracy's needs for legitimation, not by the working masses' needs. The workers are basically passive. They are limited and controlled as active objects. Even in the new model of the economic, political, and social mechanism, which is generated during the 1960s, the workers appear as individuals. The emancipatory needs and interests of the workers have no place in this model. Barr's analysis suggests the result. Compensatory needs, which can be pseudo-satisfied, are able to dominate. Barr's analysis suggests the result. Compensatory needs, which can be pseudo-satisfied, are able to dominate. But a contradiction is implicit in this process. The satisfaction of compensatory demands depends on the economic apparatus's efficiency. These compensatory demands are oriented towards the most developed model. Therefore, the bureaucracy is forced to provide, at least sporadically, just those goods which make up for the lack of emancipation in the most developed, that is, capitalist countries. Creating a consumer society to satisfy those demands, however, requires economic efficiency, and since the economic mechanism can function efficiently only when the masses are partially activated, mobilizable, and materially interested in its efficiency, this is a vicious circle, one which contributed, for example, to the explosive developments in Czechoslovakia after January 1968. On the other hand, in the long run, the masses maintain their material interest in the economic process and remain partly active only when industry functions adequately. The bureaucracy's simultaneous interest in having a functioning economic mechanism and in controlling the activity of the workers therefore produces a contradiction. If the bureaucracy cannot mask this contradiction with high economic growth rates, and so with guaranteed income increases, if it cannot satisfy the workers' compensatory needs in order to prevent their emancipatory needs from breaking out, quote, blackmailing, end quote, the workers, in colloquial terms, then the workers' activities, which are required by the system, tend to break through bureaucratic controls and to become actual industrial democracy. This was the case during the, quote, Prague Spring, end quote, in Czechoslovakia. The bureaucracy failed to satisfy workers' compensatory needs and to a certain extent their mobilization, so the workers' activities actually led to the creation of organs of self-administration. The top-down bureaucratic transmission belt, the ideological manipulation of the workers, and the moralistic appeals to proletarian solidarity and the connection with the, quote, fraternal, end quote, Soviet Union, all the party's administrative and manipulative activity, can no longer resolve the contradiction between efficiency and legitimation, which had been generated by the system of domination. It should be noted that the above description only applies to 1968 in Czechoslovakia. In the German Democratic Republic, the Soviet Union and other countries, decentralization never escaped the bureaucracy's control. There the mechanism for transmitting power worked perfectly. But the Czechoslovak situation shows that bureaucratic domination is not at all stable, and that the cycle of reform and counter-reform cannot be continued ad infinitum. As we have shown, the bureaucracy is not the foundation of domination, but the bureaucracy itself constitutes this domination. The bureaucracy is the form, based on the old division of labor, in which political despotism, in the actually socialist countries, institutionalizes itself. The mechanism of domination is very complex and cannot be described simply by referring to the bureaucratic monopolistic administration of the productive apparatus. This complexity is taken into account by the, quote, primacy of politics, end quote, concept, from which we concluded that bureaucratic domination, as well as bureaucratic domination's legitimization, is highly politicized, at least in comparison with Western capitalist societies. Consequently, a second act of revolutionary overthrow of capitalist relations is not necessary for a basic transformation of the post-revolutionary societies. Instead, as the development of the Prague Spring demonstrated, a mobilization and politicization of the masses, which will break through the subordination and the particularity in which the masses are confined by the despotic bureaucratic forms of domination, is necessary. Moreover, the mere compensation for needs, pseudo-satisfaction, must be rejected. The masses' emancipatory interests must be organized in new forms of social reproduction, which negate the old division of labor. Rudolf Barrow calls this process of fundamental transformation a, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, not in the sense in which the term was used in China during the 1960s, nor in the form in which it inspired the West European left, but in a more precise meaning which relates to the conditions of reproduction in post-revolutionary societies. In this paper, we have only begun to incorporate those concepts into a discussion which emphasizes the consequences for political strategy of the theoretical analysis. Elmar Altvater, Freie Universität, Berlin. Again, this is from 1981. I want to read the notes. Altvater's term is real existierenden sozialistischen Gesellschaften, or literally really existing socialist societies. This article follows David Fehrenbach's translation of Barrow bracket 1978 end bracket, which uses quote actual end quote to render the phrase. Implied among other things is that this quote actual socialism end quote is not the only possible kind. 2. The German word Herrschaft literally means quote lordship. Some English equivalents of the concept are quote domination, quote authority, or quote sovereign authority end quote. The term is translated throughout this article as quote domination end quote. See Weber for a discussion of the problems presented by its possible translation. 3. The German adjective Altvater uses here, quote, subalternen, end quote, as well as the abstract noun of subalternitat, have been translated in this article as, quote, subordinate or, quote, subordination. David Fehrenbach's translation of Barrow, bracket 1978, end bracket, uses, quote, subaltern and, quote, subalternity, end quote, respectively. And references are Rudolf Barrow, The Alternative in Eastern Europe, New Left Books, 1978, Isaac Deutscher, The Unfinished Revolution, Russia, 1917 to 1967, Jan Jaroslavsky, Soziologie der Kommunistischen Partei, Lawrence Crater, The Asiatic Mode of Production, Sources, Development, and Critique in the Writings of Karl Marx, and Max Weber, Economy and Society, Volume 1.